Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, thanks, Don. Welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. My guest today, Tom Gerdes of Johnson Controls Federal Systems. I want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations that are seeking certification. I do want to mention to the audience members, feel free to send in questions during the session on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I will try to work in as many of those questions as I can in the 30 minutes that we have here today. I'll start with a quick intro of Tom Gerdes. Tom is Vice President of IT at Johnson Controls Federal Systems. He leads their CMMC effort, among other transformational initiatives at Johnson Controls. Tom's background is a consultant with Ernst & Young and then became Capgemini and Deloitte. His career focus is on business transformation and specifically those transformations that are enabled by IT. He's led initiatives in global mergers and acquisitions, technology transformation, cloud migration, IT organization design and enablement, technology strategy development and implementation, and complex global program delivery. So as an IT leader, Tom knows how to drive change, as you can kind of gather from that background. And today we want to hear some of Tom's views on CMMC and specifically how Johnson Controls Federal is reacting to it and how, in his view, this cybersecurity initiative fits in with the bigger IT picture. Tom, thanks for joining us today.
Great, Ed. Thanks for having me here.
So our audience today, as has been the case throughout this series since we've been doing since May, mostly organizations that are seeking certification. All the folks that are joining these calls are tracking CMMC very closely to see how it's going to impact their business. So definitely look forward to your perspectives on this journey. As I know, we're all on this journey together. As a service provider, we're finding that many times CMMC is not a simple overlay of security onto existing IT, but rather it gets really tied in with broader IT initiatives, either driving them in some cases or being symbiotic with them. As an IT leader, how do you see CMMC intersecting with the other top things you're doing for 2021?
Yeah, I think it intersects in a couple areas, just some of the core IT work that we do, and then also how it aligns with our fiscal year 21 strategic objectives as an organization. So first, from an IT perspective, I'm working to evolve our team's thinking from what used to just be sort of DevOps to DevSecOps now to include compliance in that model. So how do we think about development, security, compliance, and operations upfront as we look at making investments in new systems, as well as the process of driving continuous improvement in our IT capabilities. So I think that's an important way to reframe how IT approaches this opportunity in terms of compliance as part of how we natively think about our capabilities. I think the other component is working with the business to make sure, as they're looking at strategic outcomes that require technology enablement, or we need to make changes to existing systems, not to miss that opportunity to educate them again on what cybersecurity is, what CMMC obligations are for us as a defense industrial based company, and then making sure we continue to drive that. So examples, when we take a look at some of the back office IT, we've got migrating legacy on-premise file storage that most people have. And how do we think about that opportunity to drive continuous improvement around our data classification, thinking about better information protection tools, and aligning that with rights management, both within the organization and as we look at the flow of CUI data across our supply chain, really gives us a great opportunity to modernize our technology, but also drive that discussion with the business in terms of how we enable them in a way that's compliant and secure.
So we're about a year in on CMMC. Give us a look back. How did you get started on CMMC? What were some of the first moves you made at Johnson Controls to kind of get this thing rolling?
Yeah, so as CMMC was sort of announced and then the model, came out in its first version, first step, we just educated within IT, starting to raise awareness within information technology as well as our compliance team around what CMMC is, what it's known to be, and where there were still a lot of open questions a year ago, Ed. I think once the framework was published, we also mapped a lot of the existing compliance work we had already done. I think we've talked about this in the past, but Johnson Controls Federal Systems is a FOCI mitigated entity. So we did a lot of work with DCSA around compliance for FOCI mitigation. So we mapped all of that work that we had done, and we continue to maintain as sort of an ongoing obligation to the DCSA into how that prepares us for CMMC, mapped that initially to the level 1 requirements, and now we're looking at the continuing work around building out an auditable platform from a CMMC level 3 perspective. I think in parallel, to close out, we also started to raise awareness within the business. So first at the board level that oversees our federal systems business, we also have a government security committee and raising awareness of what CMMC is at that level. And then across the leadership team of my peers so that the business has more lead time to understand what cybersecurity is and how CMMC is essential to our business. And we're continuing to ramp up and increase that education as part of our journey.
So Tom, you mentioned the foci, the foreign ownership situation with not unique to Johnson Controls, but not everybody has that. It would seem like that might give you more of a handle on data flows and things, maybe more tuned into that than companies that don't have to deal with those regulations. One of the things that we're seeing as a service provider, as we're taking people down the path, we're spending a lot of our time up front on the security program foundation. So getting that operational maturity in place, aligning practices with the CMMC standard, getting it all documented, those sort of things. I mean, was that something that you had to address at the start from Johnson Controls, or did you have a security program framework in place already that let you kind of skip ahead of some of those things?
Yeah, so we had a foundation in place based primarily off of the NIST cybersecurity framework and then our work with DCSA in terms of our foci mitigation. So that gave us a good footprint around some basic concepts out of, sort of good security compliance, our obligations with the DCSA around what we have to monitor for communications and how we think about our affiliates and how we operate with them, and insider threat programs and components like that. So we already had those items in place. So, but I wouldn't say that we were able to skip ahead in any way, Ed, but that we already had a good set of baseline policies, standards, procedures that we mapped into CMMC. So I think a lot of the when you look at your ISSM and all the documentation elements that come into a good program, we had a head start on that, maybe relative to some other organizations coming in new from a CMMC perspective. But I think that just also highlights some of the gaps from, DFAR 7012 and NIST 800-171 compliance and the real drive to get CMMC in place as a third-party attestation around compliance as opposed to self-attestation.
It's a big shift for sure. So, I mean, Johnson Controls, you guys are right in the middle realm, I guess, as a mid-sized contractor of about 400 million in revenues. But, your customers a lot of them are large shipbuilders. These are big companies. And I'm expecting that your supply chain includes quite a few on the small business side. So as you look kind of up and down the supply chain in different size companies, how do you think that CMMC strategy, the approach to compliance, changes with the scale of the company?
Yeah, sure. So
how do you see the challenges of your organization maybe different than what you see in bigger, smaller people?
Yeah, good question. I think so. Yeah, we work with the Navy, large shipbuilders in one component of our federal systems business. And so in that segment and others like HVAC, fire, and security, we've looked in most of our supply chain is composed of smaller companies. So did an analysis, we took a look at some third-party cybersecurity continuous monitoring and in our supply chain risk portfolio. I'd say as we take a look at it, roughly 10% of our supply chain partners are above $1 million of revenue, around 5% are between $1 million and 500,000, and then around 85% of our supply chain base have less than $500,000 in revenue. So you think about that pyramid and sort of how the defense industrial base breaks down. We've got a large number of small supply chain partners, that are super critical to our supply chain. So I think as a practical response, the strategy for how you approach CMMC has got to adjust with scale. I think large primes are going to necessarily play a role in helping push and move the defense industrial base forward. And I think we're seeing this in terms of even the initial work around the DoD assessment and the DFAR's interim rule and what you're seeing as primes communication out to their subcontractors. But I think, as we look at defense industrial base supply chain compliance, I think the knowledge, the experience, and the resources that large primes have are going to really have to form the backbone. And then as we reach out to smaller companies, I think we need to continue to grow and develop a sense of urgency in understanding obligations and driving compliance. And depending on that CMMC level requirements, I do think some smaller companies are really going to struggle to achieve level 3 compliance if they're in that $500,000 or less revenue range, just around the obligations and the effort and the documentation that's going to go into a level 3 audit. And I think that's where we're looking at. And I've seen other primes look at ways in which we can reduce or eliminate the amount of CUI we flow down to our subcontractors, or provide them with a system that they can utilize that we control and we manage from a compliance perspective in order to help support the obligations for broader defense industrial base security.
That's, yeah, good point about the CUI. And I think, I want to ask a couple of questions to kind of dive into that a little bit more. We get a lot of questions on this series and elsewhere about, what is CUI and where is it? So how do you, as you think about defining your scope, before you even get to the supply chain, I'll circle back on that a little bit. But as you look at defining your scope in terms of CUI data flows, are you looking to sort of minimize that scope for Johnson Controls as a company, or the other side, maybe cast a broad net, get everything up to level 3 to be on the safe side?
Yeah, I'd say the simple answer is we're trying to be precise in CUI and then make sure we have a conservative approach around that. I can explain that a little bit more. But going to the first part, in terms of educating on CUI, I think first it's important to collaborate across the business. And that's critical for us. We look at educating the business on what is CUI, or at least what CUI might be, and then how do we work with our contracting officers as well as our customers to make sure we understand in advance what controlled and classified information is going to flow through specific contract vehicles, and starting that conversation early. I think there are also some good reference materials out there. The DCSA has a Center for Development of Security Excellence, CDSE, that's got some good training resources, including a training curriculum around controlled and classified information. And I'll send this information off to Elizabeth so we can send it out to the participants. I think they're good reference points if the audience isn't familiar with them to take a look at. We're actually looking at incorporating some of that training into our annual training for the entire organization around CUI. As we do insider threat and other cyber training awareness throughout the course of a year, we're going to include controlled and classified information training as part of our obligatory training for our organization. In the DoD, I know Katie Arrington's mentioned this before in past broadcasts, the DoD CUI program is also a great reference, and that's dodcui.mil is another great site to go and get information and start to understand and educate. The more challenging piece when it comes to determining scope, we took what I think is a pretty straightforward approach, but it has multiple layers. First, we looked through our SSP and said, where do we store, process, or transmit CUI? Should be an easy question to answer, but it's pretty convoluted and pretty difficult to get through. But we did an initial assessment, talked about that with the business, said, okay, let's call that group 1A. We know we store, process, or transmit CUI here. Then we said, what systems control access? Even though they may not store, process, or transmit CUI, they're essential to controlling access into CUI. We called those 1B. And then we said, are there any adjacent systems that have network connectivity into applications or services that have CUI that could be a threat vector? And we called those group 2. That is our CUI scope. And then we have some disconnected systems or systems that are isolated far enough away from CUI that we put those in group 3 and said they're out of scope. So that gave us a baseline, Ed, and what we're looking through is to say, what options do I have to shift my network architecture or my application architecture to buffer more group 2 systems to move them into group 3, which reduces my scope? And then also, if I have a system and I start to profile how much controlled and classified information is inside of it, do I have 2 or 3 users who are storing CUI in a system? I can give them an alternative platform and then again start to reduce the scope that I have in place, but I have to have protections to ensure that if somebody tries to put CUI inside of that system, I can stop it. Otherwise, I've got to keep it back in the boundary. So that's really the approach we've gone through. And so I think we're trying to be precise, but if we're uncertain, we put it in scope. Over.
I really like that you kind of laid that out in a systematic way, and I appreciate you sharing that with those kind of details with everyone here. I think for people who may be listening and thinking, wow, they're a big company and I don't have that much complexity. Even relatively small companies with relatively simple IT footprints, the kind of rigor that you did is important to really look at each system, each application, if you're using cloud services, and say, is this going to have CUI or not? And make a firm commitment. I mean, one of the rules about taking this to the auditor is you've got to describe to the auditor what's where and why you defined your boundary a certain way. And the auditor has to say, I agree with your logic. So having thought it through and having made, informed choices about that ahead of time, I would say very important. I just want to kind of give a little extra emphasis to it for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the drivers for taking a structured and sort of detailed approach to how we scope it out. And then also review and acknowledgement with the data owner, which is the business side, not IT, that they agree with the assessment. And so it gives us a defensible base of how we can say, this is what's in and this is what's out, and have a model that we can walk an auditor through to say, okay, great, that makes sense. And now we can move on and get into the details of that audit handbook.
Yeah. So jumping back to the suppliers a little bit, you mentioned a minute ago before we went down that thread, you mentioned about, trying to control where you flow the data, because for these smaller companies under $500,000 revenue, maybe a pretty big burden to get to level 3. So maybe a question of, do they really need to do that? We've talked to some large primes that have said that, they're definitely on a systematic way trying to limit the number of their subcontractors that they flow CUI to. And that's going to do a couple things. I mean, it reduces the burden on them, but it also reduces risk because there's less targets for our adversaries to go after, right? So is that something that you're doing in a proactive way, meaning really looking at each supplier and saying, do we have to share CUI with this supplier or no?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. And so we expect the same approach from our customers that we work with, some of which are sort of the large primes that are already going through this review, but sort of across the board trying to coach our customer, do we really need that information to perform on this contract? Or is there a way that you can restrict it or even sanitize it such that we can step away from CUI? Now that's a conversation for another sort of web dialogue around sanitizing controlled unclassified information. But we have taken a look at our suppliers based on a couple factors. We look at annual volume, so how important are they to us in spend? How critical are they to our supply chain itself? Right? We don't spend the most money on some of the most important suppliers. And then where are we confident we flow CUI data today? And so that gave us a portfolio to look at and say, okay, we've got a group A or a top tier of suppliers that are high value. They are a risk in terms of supply chain continuity, and we are confident we give them CUI. And so that creates the foundation to say, do we need to continue to give them CUI? Can we reduce or eliminate the CUI that we provide? And if they are not able to comply with CMMC, do we have an alternative source supply, or do we need to start to cultivate alternative sources of supply in order to maintain supply chain continuity? And then that'll reveal whether or not we need to look at things like virtualized systems that we manage to allow the vendor to access CUI, but not have a data flow exfiltration route. We haven't finished that analysis yet, but those are work items that we have coming up in the next several months.
I want to work on an audience question that's kind of related to this supply chain. The question, I'll read the question, but then I'll give a little context of it here. Question is, will managed service providers, MSPs, that serve CMMC level 3 clients also need to be CMMC level 3 themselves? So as you guys are thinking about not just MSPs, but cloud providers, other service providers that you contracted with, how are you drawing that line in terms of whether to demand them to have CMMC level 3? There's some things where it's a clear flow down requirement. If you give them CUI, if they're a subcontractor, you have to flow down DFARS clauses, right? But there's other areas where it's a little more gray. How are you guys shaking that out?
Yeah, and I think this is an area where there's still going to be, I think, some uncertainty for a period of time when you start looking at what enclaves you operate in from a cloud service provider perspective. But at a high level, when we take a look at that, first off, understand whether your cloud service providers and managed service providers are FedRAMP capable. When you look at it from a cloud service perspective, I think the latest indicator is there's going to be some level of reciprocity from a FedRAMP perspective, and that's going to help say the stuff that's below the line in Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure that they provide as part of their below the line compliance foundation. The auditors can say, hey, let me go review their ATO and then we can move forward. But you still have a significant amount of above the line customer configuration that you need to manage to be compliant with CMMC level 3. So in that sense, around the cloud service providers themselves, there are some great tools out there, or at least a good starting point. Microsoft has got compliance frameworks as well as roadmaps for NIST 800-171 and a compliance framework for CMMC levels 1 through 5. And then AWS has got some compliance frameworks. They don't apply really 100% accurately to GovCloud, but they're a pretty good starting point to look at and understand the compliance of your existing workloads. When it comes to managed service providers, if they're using their systems to process, transmit, or store CUI, they will need a level 3 certification is my interpretation. If you have a cloud service provider that is using your technology and is on your network to provide those services, then you can buffer them from that obligation. So that's how we're looking at it right now, Ed. You may have some other perspectives from what you're seeing, but if the MSP on their systems is touching CUI and then they are storing, processing, or transmitting it, then what they use falls into scope, and they would, I would argue, need a CMMC level 3 certification.
I don't disagree, and I want to put in a quick plug for an event. I'll give the details at the end of the session here today, but We have a panel session next week, a cybersecurity event on the 28th, excuse me, 2 weeks. And Microsoft, Richard Wakeman of Microsoft is on the panel and hopefully going to address, because I know this is a topic specifically around use of the big cloud providers. You mentioned a few. You know, how that's going to play out is there is some uncertainty, and everybody's asking a lot of questions and watching it real close. So yeah.
And I think one other item, and I've got some of these links I can add in for Elizabeth. Microsoft, I think just recently, I say within the last few days, published a CMMC compliance placemat that you can make some selections, and it shows you what control family and what control and what configuration is part of their baseline, what you need to configure as a customer, and then sort of what's out of scope. And so again, another set of resources for companies in the defense industrial base that may use Microsoft Office 365 or Azure to help, you know, sort of accelerate their awareness of what's required in those platforms for compliance.
Yep. And you mentioned these sort of above the line configuration and management responsibilities. And that's something that, you know, many clients will do themselves if they manage it themselves, or they might hire MSP. I mean, we do a lot of that work as a managed service provider where we manage those cloud services in a compliant way. So even though the cloud service, you inherit what they're doing on the infrastructure, how you use it matters, as you pointed out, Tom. And so then the question is to align those management practices with CMMC, which, you know, again, some MSPs will take that on. Let's take a quick shift to readiness as folks are getting, you know, ready for the audit. So a lot of folks have been doing a lot of preparation, getting the earlier stuff in place that we just talked about. What are those kind of, in your view, what are those key readiness steps? What are those things that in your mind you want to see before you say, I'm ready to bring the auditor in? You know, how do you increase the chances of first-time audit success?
Yeah, I mean, so first thing I'm going to be looking for with our team is evidence, more evidence, and even more evidence. Like, do you have the evidences in place that are going to substantiate that you actually have baseline configuration of your systems, that they meet the standards and the requirements? You know, so that's a big focus for us, is looking through every entry in the SSP across CMMC level 3, and can we produce the appropriate evidence, and can we do it in a way that's consistent with reading through the 420 pages in the level 3 assessment handbook. And so I think the other readiness effort is to actually go through and do the work to read through it, right? Level 1 assessment guide's 54 pages, level 3 is 430 pages, and they're dense pages. But I think making sure your compliance team is going through and reading what the auditor has been coached to look for, and be prepared to respond to that, and know that you're going to have, you know, good solid responses in place, that they're well articulated, and that they're in place. And I think one of the reasons for that, and another thing of driving first-time success, and I think this is still maybe subject to some accreditation body in DoD alignment, but if there's a practice that's missing, unlike a DIBCAC audit, you can't fix it overnight and show them the next day, because where's the process maturity? And so at a level 3, you know, it really is going to be essential not just to have the documentation and the evidence that you're executing a practice, but how do you demonstrate process maturity that, hey, here's my continuous, you know, sort of recording of changes in a, you know, change review board, and that those align with information that's in my SSP, and then I can tie them in with policy to show that I've got the documentation, I'm executing the practice, and I've got evidences that I have maturity of that over time, not something that smells like it just came off the laser printer 3 minutes ago. And so for me, I think that's going to be the big piece. Can I ask my team and then respond that, yes, we can demonstrate that we have been doing this. It's known, it's implemented, and it's been successfully documented.
This is a great point, because the maturity is sort of a new thing in terms of trying to formally measure that. And that's what auditors have to do. They have to say, is this institutionalized? And the ink being dry is a key part of that assessment, I would think, right?
Yeah.
Do they see evidence that you've been doing it for a while? A couple of great audience questions that are related to this I want to work in. And so one of them kind of goes to something you just mentioned a little bit. It says, I heard the CMMC model is all or none compliance. POAMs will not count towards your CMMC level, which is accurate. Can't have any open items. Question is, do you think they, meaning the auditors, will take low risk, non-compliant practices and allow you to still obtain your intended level? So, I mean, before you answer, I'll say I've asked this question of auditors that are trained under the provisional program. I've asked this question of Katie Arrington, but as a practitioner, as somebody who really does this for a living, I want to ask you, what do you think is going to happen when you get to the audit, really low risk, non-compliant practices? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, so, well, the intent of CMMC is to be risk-based. My view is it's binary. And so I think having a low risk, non-compliant control is a higher probability of a failure than it is getting a pass and saying it's not a big deal. I hope that there's some intelligence, some evolution there, but this is the hard part. How do you scale a consistent way of assessing risk that is not binary when you try to scale it to, depend on your estimates, hundreds of thousands of defense industrial based companies, that auditors are going to have a consistent interpretation of what's viewed as low risk, given what COI you have, how you're operating, the size of your network, the size of your system, the number of users, the number of threat vectors that are in place. I think it gets to be so complex that it's an easier and safer answer for an auditor who's subject to a re-review by the accreditation board to say, you didn't pass the control, you fail. So I think that's where it's going to be evolving. But for our readiness within Johnson Control Federal Systems, we need to have full coverage and we need to pass even if it's low risk. I think the piece that will be interesting to see is, okay, if you have a low risk non-pass, you try to go get a DoD CIO, pass that you can actually not have that control in place. And then how you interpret some of the other rules around, when you look at the DoD assessment methodology and how that differs from the CMC assessor handbook to say, hey, I'm implementing it right now, or it's a short-term gap, or the system itself is fundamentally not compliant. Where do I have sufficient compensating controls that would not be compliant verbatim to the handbook, but would provide the same efficacy when I look at compensating controls? I think that's going to be the interesting piece to see as Pathfinder programs are finalized and the assessors themselves go through level 3 assessments to then begin performing those assessments.
I think you're right on, Tom. I think if somebody who says, I don't comply, they're going to fail. Somebody who says, I believe I comply, but I've done it a slightly different way than the letter of the law, and here's my story, and here's why the efficacy is the same, I think they should pass. I mean, we've heard from Katie Arrington that CMMC should not be viewed as a checklist. And, a lot of, I guess, let me turn this into a question. How much of the work you're doing is about compliance and how much is about effectiveness, meaning deterring adversaries, right? And when you have to balance those out, when the two are not aligned, and they're not always aligned, how do you balance the fact that, no matter how effective your security is at stopping bad guys, you still have to pass the audit too?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually was talking with my, GRC lead yesterday on this very topic. He's like, well, from an auditor, they would want to go in this order. It's like, yeah, but this third item is more important to our overall security efficacy than the top two. So it is a balancing act. I asked that question around, yes, I need to do things to ensure I've got compliance and that we maintain that on a continuous basis, but some near-term choices may actually provide better security, even though it doesn't advance the ball forward from a compliance perspective. Right now, I default to better security, but I think over the coming, sort of months, that's going to default to a balance to then now I've got to weight heavily towards compliance as the outcome. And I think that's going to be one of the challenges of, well, CMMC isn't intended to be a checklist. The assessor's handbook certainly reads like one, right? And I think how you have to prepare and go through an audit is very much that, right? I have to have all my ducks in a row. I have to have the documentation ready and accessible. I've got to have the experts available for follow-up questions. And if you don't prepare for that in a rigorous way, I think you're going to have a difficult time convincing an auditor that you've got everything documented, that you've got maturity in your processes for a level 3 attestation. And so, again, I hope that the model and the program itself continues to look at a risk-based approach, but I'm taking the viewpoint that I have to view it as a very black and white binary checklist exercise and balance my business outcomes to achieve effective security and effective cyber controls in parallel with that effort.
That's good insight. And I mean, there's a lot of folks out there who've never really taken any of their cybersecurity through audit, right? So it's a new experience for them, and they're not real sure what to expect. And in some quarters, that's been a common occurrence. But in other parts of the DIB, it's not something that has been through an audit because of any other program. They don't have SOC 1, SOC 2, any of these other things that might, might cause that. Hey, so we're kind of near the end of our time. I want to ask you kind of a closeout question. I had another couple audience questions I was trying to work in and have run out of time, but maybe we'll have a follow-on session at some point. To close us out today, I guess as someone who has really tuned into strategic transformation, I want to ask you for one piece of advice on CMMC. This is an initiative that promises to be transformative. So in thinking about all the players, so government, contractors, service providers, the tech vendors, the auditors, what's your advice to that whole ecosystem, that whole community, on how we maximize the transformative power of CMMC? How do we get the most bang for our buck?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting opportunity, for us to look at how we think about and shift our mindset around cybersecurity. I think in terms of what's the most important thing for us to do across the defense industrial base is to communicate in clear terms. And I think this starts early in the life cycle of how we think about what CMMC is intending to do, which is protect FCI and CUI. And so as I work with our sales leaders and our operational leaders to say early on, we need to have a conversation with the government customer when we're the prime, or with the larger primes that we work with in some parts of our business, to not just say, here are the flow down terms and accept them and move on with our day, but to say, well, that's great, but they apply to what specific information? How is it going to be communicated? How is it going to be disseminated? What are the expectations for how we flow that data and protect it? And if you have those conversations early, it clarifies a lot of the downstream questions that you're going to have around, well, do I get it? How do I get it? What if you receive CUI through an email system that you didn't anticipate having CUI, and now suddenly you've got an issue with compliance? And so I think as we take a look at that, that's important. In sort of trying to answer at a higher level the more difficult question, I think finally getting to a point where we can more universally define and identify and have clarity on what is controlled unclassified information, what is the important stuff that we need to manage, is paramount to our success. Otherwise, you're going to have some companies that say really narrow slice of an enclave of systems where I have CUI. Others are going to take the approach, well, I'm just going to put everything under a boundary of CUI. And at the end of the day, we're starting to try to protect everything, which it's cliche to say, but then we're not really protecting anything. I think we have to really identify what is the essential information we are flowing, and then make sure we put our efforts on focus on protecting that and protecting it across the entire defense industrial base.
Tom, thanks very much. This was excellent information today. Really appreciate your candor, sharing it with us. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to the audience for joining as well. Please join us again for future town hall meetings. Our next session of this series will be Wednesday, January 20th at our regular time of 1 p.m. Eastern. And I mentioned earlier, but I'll give a little more detail now. We have a half-day Cybersecurity Summit coming up the afternoon of January 28th. This will cover the entire path to CMMC, starting with legal interpretation, looking at filling the gaps, how to fill those gaps, the assessment process itself. It's going to have a keynote at the end where we look at the wake of SolarWinds and the incident, the incidents that are going to flow from that hack. So we have some really great speakers lined up. I mentioned Richard Wakeman from Microsoft. Katie Arrington's going to be there. So we have a lot of people presenting some very good information. It's going to be jam-packed. Please watch for an invitation if you're on our mailing list, or head to our website at neosystemscorp.com for all the details. I want to thank everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Ed.